My estranged son came back after 5 years saying, "We're good now. I forgive you," and I let myself believe he wanted his mother back. Thank God I never told him about the $500 million my late husband left behind, because 3 weeks later, he and his wife showed up with a notary and a folder. I was never supposed to question the notary was holding her stamp wrong. I know that sounds like a small thing. A strange thing to notice when your daughter-in-law is smiling at you with all her teeth and sliding a folder across your kitchen table like a birthday present. But I've signed 100 notarized documents in my 71 years. Real estate closings, trust amendments, corporate filings, charitable disbursements, and I know what a notary looks like when she's done this 1,000 times. She rests, she breathes, she checks the seal. This woman was gripping that stamp so hard her knuckles had gone pale. Lissa said, "We just need a few signatures, Doreen, for everyone's peace of mind." And I looked at my son standing behind her, still wearing his father's brown jacket, still holding his hat in his hands the way Sherwood used to, when Sherwood was nervous but didn't want to show it. And I thought, Sherwood would know exactly what this is. I smiled. I made my voice warm and easy. "Let me just call Aldous real quick," I said, "since we're discussing my affairs," and I put him on speaker before Lissa could find the right expression to wear. "Here's what I need you to understand about the 5 years before my son knocked on my door. They were not 5 quiet years. They were 5 years of building something, quietly, methodically, the way Sherwood always said you should build anything that matters. You lay the foundation when no one's watching. You shore up the walls before the storm comes. You don't announce the project until it's done." Sherwood James Elmore died on a Thursday in March. 4 years before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning I held his hand and watched his breathing slow down to nothing. He was 66 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years turning a small Birmingham trucking company into a regional logistics network, then a national freight operation, then, through a series of acquisitions he executed with the patient precision of a man who read every contract twice before signing, something considerably larger. The final number, once the estate was fully valued, was not a secret I kept because I was ashamed of it. I kept it because Sherwood told me to. "The wrong people find out what you have," he told me once, early in our marriage, when we were still building, "and they stop seeing you. They start seeing the number." I didn't have to ask what he meant. I'd watched it happen to his first wife's family when her father died. I watched cousins who'd ignored her for a decade suddenly appear with opinions about what she owed them. I watched lawyers show up with documents nobody remembered signing. I watched her spend 3 years untangling a mess that never should have been made in the first place. Sherwood spent the last 2 years of his life making sure that wouldn't happen to me. I didn't fully appreciate the extent of what he'd built until Aldous Pemberton sat across from me in his office on Montrose Avenue 2 weeks after the funeral and walked me through the trust structure. Aldous Pemberton III, Esquire, 31 years in estate and trust law, the kind of attorney who still handwrites notes in the margins of documents, had been Sherwood's lawyer for 22 years. He was the kind of man who called you Mrs. Elmore and meant it as a full sentence. He handed me a summary document and said, "Sherwood was very thorough." That was an understatement. The trust had layers I hadn't known about. Provisions that would only activate under specific conditions. A duplex on Garfield Avenue that had been placed in a separate holding entity, with income flowing to me but title held in a structure that required dual signatures to transfer. A charitable foundation with its own board and council. A flagging protocol, Aldis's word, that would alert him any time someone tried to access the full trust portfolio, without going through him directly. "Why all of this?" I asked. Aldous paused, set down his pen. "He was worried about Steve," he said. "Not about Steve exactly, about who might get to Steve." I didn't answer, because I already knew what he meant, and because knowing it was the part that hurt. Stephen Marcus Elmore, my son, my firstborn, the boy who used to sleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms and cry at the end of every baseball season because the summer was over, and the summer meant something to him that I still don't have words for. We hadn't spoken in 5 years when he appeared at my door. The silence started over something that was real, and something that was also, I've come to understand, the first quiet pressure Lissa ever applied to our family. She didn't like that I'd questioned their finances after Steve lost his position at the shipping company. She didn't like that I'd offered to help, which she heard as interference. She said things to Steve that I'll never fully know, and Steve said things to me that I've tried hard to forgive. And then one day, the call stopped and the invitation stopped, and I found myself spending Thanksgiving with my neighbor Margaret and her 3 daughters instead of my own child. I told myself it was temporary, a season. It wasn't a season. It was 5 years. So when he appeared on my porch on a cold Tuesday in October, wearing his father's jacket, turning his hat in his hands, I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, I let him in, I made coffee. He said, "Mama, I've been carrying this too long. I just needed to say I forgive you. Forgive me." For what exactly, he didn't specify. But I understood what he needed from that sentence, and I gave it to him. I said I was glad he was there. I said I'd missed him. Both of those things were true. What I didn't say, what I held back, the way Sherwood had trained me, the way Aldous had confirmed, was anything about the estate, anything about the trust, anything about what Sherwood had left behind. When Steve asked carefully how I was managing, I said, "Just fine." When he asked about the properties, please. I said Sherwood had set things up well. When he asked if I had good people helping me, I said yes. I have an attorney I trust. Lissa, sitting beside him, smiled and said that was wonderful. That family should be close, that she'd always hoped we could rebuild. I smiled back. I said I hoped so too. That night, after they left, I called Aldous and told him Steve had come home. There was a pause on the line. I'll make a note, he said. Let me know if anything feels off. 3 Sundays in, it started. Not dramatically, not with a demand or an ultimatum, with questions. Lissa asked which pharmacy I used, which doctor handled my prescriptions, whether my hip was getting worse. She'd noticed I shifted my weight when I stood up. Had I seen someone about that? She said it with such genuine warmth, such careful attention. I told myself it was care. I told myself she was trying. It wasn't care. It was inventory. The following Wednesday, she mentioned her cousin, Vereen Aldridge. Said Vereen did geriatric care coordination, not nursing, Doreen, just support, just making sure older folks have what they need, and that she'd love to stop by, just to see if there was anything I might benefit from. No pressure, just a conversation. I said I'd think about it. She sent Vereen the next morning without waiting for my answer. Vereen Aldridge arrived at 10 a.m. with a practiced smile and a small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. She was maybe 45, dressed carefully, with the specific manner of someone who had learned to make authority feel like helpfulness. She asked me questions, whether I forgot where I put things, whether names slipped away from me sometimes, whether I ever left the stove on, and wrote everything down before I finished answering. I answered carefully. I answered truthfully, mostly. I mentioned that I'd misplaced my reading glasses recently. I mentioned that I sometimes had to think twice before recalling a neighbor's last name. These are not signs of cognitive decline. These are signs of being 71. But the way Vereen wrote them down, that careful, deliberate notation, I felt it. Something about the quality of her attention, the way she paused after each answer as if she were filing it somewhere specific. A week later, Vereen arrived for a second visit. Before I'd said a word, she mentioned that I must have found my glasses. She could see them on the side table. I hadn't told her they were missing. I'd mentioned it offhandedly to Steve at dinner the previous Sunday. Lissa had told her. Before I'd said a word, my kitchen table had become a reporting station. I didn't react. I've learned over 71 years that the most useful thing you can do when someone underestimates you is let them keep doing it. But that evening I called Aldous. I told him what I'd observed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Doreen, I need you to listen carefully, and I need you not to change your behavior yet. Can you do that? I said yes. Good, he said. Let them keep coming. The gas shutoff notice was real. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I had buried it under a pile of mail during a week when I had a bad cold and wasn't moving through the house the way I usually do. It was a genuine oversight. Steve found it on a Tuesday. Genuinely alarmed, eyes soft, hands dusty from some project he'd been working on. He said, Mama, I just want to help. That part was probably also real. I don't think my son is entirely without love for me. I think he loves me the way a man loves something he's been quietly convinced is slipping away, with urgency, with a little bit of grief, and with someone standing behind him telling him what that grief requires. I gave him access to a joint account, a small one, $8,000 I kept liquid for household expenses. I said it was just for bills, nothing major. 3 weeks later, he transferred $4,000 out of it. The memo line read, Care Assessment Services. I sat with my morning coffee and read that line 4 times. Care Assessment Services. He was paying Vereen to document my lapses, to visit my home to take her notes, to build a picture of a woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. And I had funded every single page of that picture. I set down my coffee cup. I did not throw it. I did not cry. I called Aldous and said, it's time to move. Aldous J. Pemberton III had seen this before. Elder financial exploitation, he told me, in the flat, measured tone of a man who has spent 3 decades watching families do terrible things to each other over money. It's the fastest growing category of financial crime in the country. Cognitively intact adults are targeted just as often as those with actual decline, because the goal isn't to exploit confusion. It's to create the appearance of confusion, to build a record that supports a future legal action. What kind of legal action? Guardianship petition, conservatorship, a claim that you lack capacity to manage your own affairs. If successful, it removes your legal autonomy entirely. Someone else controls your assets, your medical decisions, your property. You'd have no more legal standing than, he stopped, chose a different word. You'd have significantly diminished rights. I thought about Vereen's notebook. I thought about Steve transferring $4,000 labeled Care Assessment Services. I thought about Lissa asking which pills I kept where, with that practiced warmth, that attentive smile. I thought about Sherwood, sitting across from me in this same kitchen 30 years ago, saying, the wrong people find out what you have, and they stop seeing you. What do we do? I asked. We document everything from this point forward, Aldous said. Dates, times, conversations. If they ask you to sign anything, you refuse and call me immediately. And I need you to trust me on something else. There's a process I want to begin quietly before they make their next move. He began that process the same afternoon. What that process entailed, I'll tell you in a moment. But first, the duplex. I found out about the duplex by accident. Sherwood bought that property the year before he died. 4212 Garfield Avenue. A 2-unit brick building with original hardwood floors and a front porch with a step he always meant to fix. He bought it as income property and as a guarantee. This "This one's for you," he told me. "When everything else gets complicated, this one stays simple." My tenant, Mrs. Pauline Okafor, had been there for 6 years. She called me on a Tuesday about a leaking faucet in the upstairs unit. I drove over myself. I always drove over myself for the small things, because I liked seeing the building, liked feeling connected to something Sherwood had chosen with care. When I turned onto Garfield, I saw the sign, "For sale, under contract, pending." The red letters were the specific red of a real estate company I recognized. The sign was staked directly into what I thought of as Sherwood's front lawn. Mrs. Okafor came out onto the porch when she saw my car. She looked at my face and said, "Oh, Mrs. Elmore, I assumed you knew." She told me Steve had been there with an inspector 2 weeks prior. A woman from the listing agency had given Mrs. Okafor 30 days notice to vacate. Standard language typed on letterhead, very official. Mrs. Okafor had assumed I'd sent him. She'd been quietly grieving the loss of an apartment she'd loved for 6 years, and she'd done it silently because she thought I'd made a decision. I sat in my car outside Sherwood's building for a full minute. The step was still chipped. His handwriting on the mailbox label, black marker, careful block letters, still faintly visible under a coat of newer paint. My hands were in my lap. I noticed they were shaking. I called Aldous before I left the curb. The document Steve had asked me to sign 6 weeks earlier. The one Lissa had explained as just adding him as a helper in case something comes up, Doreen. Nothing formal. Had not added him as a helper. His handwriting on the mailbox label, black marker, careful block letters, still faintly visible under a coat of newer paint. My hands were in my lap. I noticed they were shaking. I called Aldous before I left the curb. The document Steve had asked me to sign 6 weeks earlier. The one Lissa had explained as just adding him as a helper in case something comes up, Doreen. Nothing formal. Had not added him as a helper in case something came up. It had granted him a limited power of attorney for real property transactions involving my residential holdings. Lissa's exact words when she explained the document were, "It's what Sherwood would have wanted." She was right that Sherwood had thought about this. She was wrong about which direction he'd planned for. What none of them knew, what I had never told anyone except Aldous, was that the duplex's title had been placed inside a holding entity called Elmore Garfield LLC, of which I was the sole managing member, and that Aldous had structured the LLC operating agreement specifically to require his sign-off on any transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property. The power of attorney Steve had signed didn't transfer to the LLC. It only applied to properties held in my personal name. The sale was a legal impossibility. Aldous had the transaction frozen by the next morning. He filed an emergency injunction citing unauthorized attempted disposition of trust-adjacent assets, and the title company, once they received his letter and understood the LLC structure, rescinded the under-contract status within 48 hours. The listing agency called Steve. I don't know what he said to them. He didn't call me. He didn't call me for 11 days. Aldous also told me something else that morning, something that snapped the remaining pieces into place with the clean sound of a lock engaging. 3 weeks before my conversation with Vereen about my reading glasses, someone had submitted a formal request to his office, in writing, on what appeared to be letterhead from a care management company I'd never heard of, seeking full disclosure of the Elmore family trust portfolio, not just the duplex. Everything. Every asset, every account, every structure Sherwood had spent the last 2 years of his life building. Aldous' office had denied the request and flagged it as suspicious. They hadn't told me immediately because they were tracking it. The request had come through an intermediary, a notary public and document services company that, when Aldous' associate investigated it, turned out to share a registered agent with Vereen Aldridge's care coordination business, the notary, the same type of woman Lissa brought to my kitchen. They were building the legal scaffolding, Aldous told me. The care assessments created a record of diminished capacity. The power of attorney gave Steve apparent authority over the property. The trust inquiry was meant to identify every asset, and then they bring in a notary. I said. He paused. Yes. And I signed something I'm not supposed to read carefully. That would be the sequence? Yes. I thought about Lissa's smile, that practiced warmth, the way she said everyone's peace of mind like it was a sentence that had always existed, waiting for this moment. How long have you known? I asked. I've suspected for about 3 weeks, Aldous said carefully. I wanted to be certain before I alarmed you. And the trust? Is the trust protected? Completely. Sherwood built it that way on purpose. He paused again. He wrote a letter. Marguerite had been holding it since the funeral. Marguerite Osei, my neighbor for 19 years, the woman who brought me sweet potato pie every October and sat with me through the worst Thursday in March of my life, appeared at my door the morning after I called Aldous from the curb outside the duplex. She was holding a wooden box I recognized. Sherwood had kept it in his study. I'd assumed it was empty. Inside was an envelope, my name on it, in Sherwood's handwriting. He gave it to me at the hospital, Margaret said. He told me to hold it until I thought you needed it. He was very specific about that, until you think she needs it. Not at the funeral. Not when you're grieving, when you need it. I held the envelope for a moment before I opened it. Sherwood wrote in the clear, direct way he wrote everything. No sentimentality in the structure, but love in every word. He said he was sorry for what he suspected might happen. He said he knew Steve's heart was good, but that a good heart aimed in the wrong direction, by the wrong person, could do real damage. He said he had watched Lissa from the first day Steve brought her home, and that he had liked her fine, but that he had noticed the way she listened to conversations about money, with a quality of attention that was different from how she listened to everything else. He said he had spoken to Aldous, that Aldous knew everything, that the trust had protections built into it specifically for this scenario, and that if any of what he feared came to pass, I should go to Aldous immediately and let him work. He said, "You are not fragile. Don't let anyone convince you that you are. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I was lucky enough to be married to you for 40 years. He said, "I love you. Please don't let them have it." I read it twice. Then I drove to Aldous and signed every reversal document he had waiting. I got home at 2:20 that afternoon. I had not gone straight home from Aldous's office. I drove to Garfield Avenue first, parked in front of the duplex, and sat there for a few minutes. The for sale sign was still there. They hadn't removed it yet, but there was something different about it now. It no longer made my chest hollow. It made me feel the specific satisfaction of knowing something that hasn't become real yet, because the paperwork is still being processed and the machinery is still turning, but the outcome is already certain. I'd felt that once before. At a closing table in 1987, when Sherwood and I signed the papers on our first real property together, a commercial lot we'd scraped and saved for, and I remember looking at his hands across the table and thinking, we did it. Not triumphant, quiet. The thing was done, and now we'd carry it forward. That's what I felt sitting outside Sherwood's duplex. Mrs. Okafor came out onto the porch again when she saw my car. I got out and we stood together for a moment. I told her the sale was frozen, that she wasn't going anywhere, that I was sorry for the notice she'd received. She held my hand for a moment with both of hers. She said, "Sherwood was a good man. He picked a good woman." I drove home. 3 cars were parked at my curb. Lissa's Acura, which I recognized, a silver sedan I didn't know, and a white Honda Accord I'd later learned belonged to the notary, the same woman, or one just like her, who'd been arranging this moment for weeks. Lissa was on my porch. Vereen stood beside her, holding a folder thick enough to make a sound when she shifted it. The third woman, mid-40s, careful blazer, leather bag with the specific weight of someone who carries stamps and seals for a living, stood slightly behind them, like punctuation. Steve was not there. I noticed that. I noticed it precisely. The way you notice the thing that's been removed from a room. Lissa smiled when she saw me. The full-teeth smile. The warmth that had nothing warm behind it. "Doreen," she said, "we were hoping to catch you. We just need a few signatures, for everyone's peace of mind." I looked at my own front door, my keys still in my hand, Sherwood's handwriting still fresh in my chest. I noticed the notary's knuckles were pale. I smiled back. "Let me just call Aldous real quick," I said. "Since we're discussing my affairs." I didn't wait for Lissa's expression to adjust. I dialed. He picked up on the first ring, because I had texted him from the driveway. "They're here." I put him on speaker. The silence that followed, the 2, 3, 4 seconds before anyone spoke, was the most satisfying silence I have ever stood inside. Vereen's folder shifted in her arms. The notary's stamp disappeared into her bag. Lissa's smile did something complicated around the edges. "Lissa," Aldous said, in his flat, dry 31 years of this voice, "I understand you've come to the property with documentation. I'd like you to know that as of this morning, the limited power of attorney executed on October 14th has been formally revoked. The joint account has been closed. The Garfield Avenue property is under injunction, and I'll be filing a complaint with the state licensing board regarding Vereen Aldridge's care coordination practice within the week." He paused. "I'd also like you to know that the conversation happening right now is being recorded with Mrs. Elmore's full knowledge and consent under Alabama's single-party recording statute. So if any of you has anything you'd like to say for the record, this would be the moment." No one said anything. "That's what I thought," Aldous said. "I'd recommend you leave the property." They left. The notary first, quickly, without eye contact, the leather bag clutched against her chest. Vereen next, still holding the folder, walking to the silver sedan with the specific posture of a woman who has practiced looking professional under pressure and is currently failing. Lissa last. She stood at the edge of my porch steps for a moment, and I watched her decide not to say the thing she wanted to say. She walked to her car. She drove away. I stood on my own porch until all 3 cars had turned the corner. Then I sat down in the porch chair, the one Sherwood bought at an estate sale in 2009, the one with the loose armrest he never got around to tightening, and I breathed. The formal accounting came over the following weeks. Margaret O'Say, no relation to my neighbor Margaret, different person entirely, was the investigator Aldous retained from Gresham Forensic Services, a Birmingham-based firm specializing in elder financial exploitation. Margaret O'Say, CFE, 14 years in forensic accounting with a specific focus on trust litigation and elder fraud. She spent 3 weeks going through every transaction, every document, every interaction that had touched my finances since Steve's return. I met with her twice. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with a quiet, methodical way of moving through information that reminded me of Sherwood. She spread everything out on Aldis's conference table: bank records, the power of attorney document, printed emails recovered from a forwarding address Lissa had used on the LLC correspondence, and Vereen's assessment notes, which Aldis's team had subpoenaed from the care coordination company's business records. She walked me through it the way a doctor walks you through a scan. Here is the structure. Here is the problem. Here is what we know and what we're still determining. They were thorough, she said at one point. So was my husband, I said. She looked up from the papers. Yes, she said. He really was. I've been doing this for 14 years, and I have not seen a trust this well constructed for the specific purpose of preventing exactly this. Whoever did his estate planning understood what they were protecting against. He understood, I said. It wasn't abstract for him. He watched it happen to someone else. She nodded, made a note. That's usually how the best protection gets built, she said. Not from theory, from watching. What she found, the $4,000 transferred from the joint account had been paid to Vereen Aldridge's LLC, Aldridge Coordinated Care Solutions, LLC, registered in Tennessee, which was co-owned by Lissa's cousin and a third party Aldis was still identifying. The care assessments Vereen had conducted were not licensed psychological evaluations. They were informal observations recorded in language that mimicked clinical documentation, designed to create a paper trail that appeared to support a capacity finding without requiring actual credentials or a court-authorized evaluation. The limited power of attorney had been drafted by a document preparation service, not a licensed attorney. When Aldis showed it to me originally, the document I'd signed without reading carefully enough, the one Lissa had described as just adding him as a helper, his associate had flagged it as unusual. They'd attempted to contact me through Steve, who told them his mother had reviewed it with her own counsel. She had not. The trust disclosure request had come from a company called Meridian Care Partners, LLC, a shell registered in Georgia with a single registered agent who, when Aldis's investigator visited the listed address, turned out to be a mailbox at a UPS store in Buckhead. 3 LLCs, 3 states, 1 family dinner table. Detective Renata Hollis of the Birmingham Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit, 23 years on the force, the last 8 specifically in financial exploitation, took the full file from Aldis in November. She was a tall woman with very still hands and the manner of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by anything, but remains somehow genuinely committed to being bothered by it. She told me at our first meeting, "This is sophisticated, but it's also documented. That's not common." My husband was thorough, I said. He really was, she said, and she said it with something close to admiration. The guardianship petition had been drafted. That was the part that took my breath away when Aldis showed it to me. They had already prepared it. 19 pages citing Vereen's care assessments, citing the gas shutoff notice, which Steve had photographed, citing 3 separate observed incidents of confusion that Lissa had apparently documented in a private journal she'd started keeping in October. It named Steve as proposed guardian. It cited the limited power of attorney as evidence of my prior consent to his authority. If they had gotten my signature on whatever was in that folder, on whatever the notary with the pale knuckles had driven over to witness, they would have filed that petition within days. What would it have meant? I asked Aldis, though I already knew. At minimum, a hearing. At minimum, months of litigation while your assets were frozen pending a capacity determination. At worst, he stopped. The structure Sherwood built would have made it very difficult for them to succeed, but difficult isn't impossible, and litigation is expensive and exhausting regardless of the outcome. They were betting I'd settle, I said. Yes, to make it stop. The structure Sherwood built would have made it very difficult for them to succeed, but difficult isn't impossible, and litigation is expensive and exhausting regardless of the outcome. They were betting I'd settle, I said. Yes, to make it stop. Yes, I thought about that. About the version of this story where I'm a slightly less careful woman, where I sign the October document without a second thought, where I don't call Aldis from the curb outside the duplex, where I open the folder Vereen is holding and I read the first page, and the language is just technical enough to confuse me, and Lissa is right there, warm and reassuring, saying it's just standard, Doreen, everyone signs these. I thought about that woman, not very different from me, and I felt something I can only describe as grateful fury. The petition was never filed. Detective Hollis moved quickly. By December, Vereen Aldridge's care coordination license, which turned out to be a certification, not a state license, and a certification from a body Hollis's team determined was essentially self-issued, had been reported to the Tennessee Department of Health and the National Association of Social Workers. The State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division opened an inquiry into Meridian Care Partners, LLC. The document preparation service that had drafted the power of attorney was issued a cease and desist for unauthorized practice of law. Lissa was interviewed twice. She retained an attorney, a real one I should note, for both conversations. Steve was interviewed once. I don't know everything that was said in those rooms. I know that Detective Hollis called me afterward and said only he didn't know everything, but he knew enough. I've sat with that sentence many times since. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. I've tried to map in my own mind what he knew and when he knew it. I think he knew Lissa was taking the situation seriously. I think he knew Vereen was building some kind of documentation. I think he knew, at the level where knowing lives in the body, not the mind, that what was happening in my house was not simply care. I think he chose, at each small decision point, to tell himself a story about what it was instead. I know that mechanism. I've done it myself. It's human. It's also a choice, and the choices accumulate. What I don't know is whether he knew about the guardianship petition. I don't know if he understood the full architecture of what he was participating in, or if he understood only the part that was pointed in the direction that felt, to him, like love, like protection, like doing the right thing by his aging mother, who surely needed help, who surely couldn't manage everything on her own. I think about the brown jacket, his father's jacket, worn to my door on a cold Tuesday, hat turning in his hands. I think about how he knew to wear it, whether Lissa suggested it or whether he reached for it himself, reaching for something that would make me open the door, whether it was calculation or instinct. I think it might have been both. And I think that's the part that's hardest. I think about the man who appeared on my porch wearing his father's jacket, turning his hat in his hands, saying, "Mama, I forgive you." I think about what it means to love someone who has pointed that love in the wrong direction, for long enough that the love and the wrong direction have become, for him, the same thing. I don't know what happens to Steve. I don't know if there are charges. I don't know if Lissa is still his wife by the time anyone reads this. I know what Sherwood's letter said about Steve's heart and about the person who aimed it, and I know that I am his mother and that those two facts will always be true simultaneously. That is not a simple thing to hold, but I'm holding it. Mrs. Okafor is still in the duplex. Aldous drafted a new lease for her in December. Longer term, slightly reduced rent in acknowledgement of the disruption. She brought me a pot of jollof rice when I came to deliver the new paperwork. We ate on the porch, and I looked at the step that was still chipped, and I thought about Sherwood buying this building the year before he died, saying this one's for you. He was right. It was. Marguerite came for coffee the following week. We talked about the wooden box, about the letter, about the fact that he'd given it to her specifically, not to Aldous. Not to me, not to any lawyer or executor, but to my neighbor with her sweet potato pies and her steady hands, because he trusted her to know when I needed it. "He knew you," she said. "He just knew you completely." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the reading glasses I'd found right where I'd left them, on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, which is where I always leave them, which is where I will always leave them, because I am a woman in full possession of her faculties and her property and her life. He knew what was coming, I finally said. He just made sure it couldn't get here. I had one more conversation with Aldous in January. He told me the full picture of the trust, the complete structure Sherwood had built, every layer, every protection. I'd known the general shape of it. I hadn't known all the specifics. The number at the center of it, the estate's total value, is something I'm not going to put in writing here. What I will say is that it is a number that would have changed everything for anyone who got their hands on it. That would have felt, to the wrong kind of person, like a reason to do exactly what was done. What I will also say is that not $1 of it moved. Not one. Sherwood built the vault. Aldous held the key. And I, a 71-year-old woman with reading glasses on the windowsill and a chipped step she hasn't fixed yet either, I stood on my own porch and put my attorney on speaker. That was all it took. That was always all it was going to take. There's a version of this story where I tell you I'm at peace, where I've healed, where I've forgiven, where I've found some clean and quiet place on the other side of all of it. That version would be partially true and mostly incomplete. What's true? I sleep well. The trust is intact. Mrs. Okafor's faucet has been fixed. Margaret came for Easter dinner and brought the sweet potato pie, and we sat on the porch until the light went gold and warm and low. I have a good attorney. I had a good husband. I have a good neighbor. What's also true, my son has not called. I have not called him either. I keep his father's letter on the kitchen counter, not displayed exactly, just there, in reach, the way you keep something you might need to hold again. Sherwood wrote, "You are not fragile. Don't let anyone convince you that you are. I wasn't fragile. I am not fragile, but I am a mother." And that part, the part that opened the door in October, that heard Mama and felt a key turn in a lock, that part is not fragile either. It is just what it is. Maybe that's the thing I'm still learning to hold, that loving someone and protecting yourself from them are not opposites, that a door can be opened and still have a lock. That warmth and caution can live in the same chest, in the same moment, in the same woman standing on her own front porch with her keys in her hand and her attorney on the phone. I learned that from Sherwood. I am still learning it from myself.